Welcome, everybody, to downtown Hammond Towle Theater. Thank you very much for coming. Yeah, give you a round of applause. Woo! Let's have another round of applause when I'm done speaking. I didn't.
That was a softball. That was easy.
I know the light is in my eyes, but Chancellor Keon, I saw you. You did it right in front of me. So, by the way, I know my name is Phil Towle. I'm the Chief of Staff for the City of Hammond. I'm going to welcome you, and I have the honor of introducing our guest today. I do have to use the mic. I'm loud enough without it, as most of you know, but because there's a video, they're asking me to use it, so that's why I'm doing that. We are very excited that all of you are here with us today, that you took time, personal time out of your evening to be here for something that we think is extremely important for not only downtown Hammond, but all of Hammond. So thank you very much for coming out on this colder evening in downtown. We are honored today to have a very special guest that you're going to learn a little bit about as I introduce him, because I have just a little bit of his resume, and I mean a little bit. But this is a very special event for us. Earlier today, we had a walk through of downtown Hammond with Mr. Speck, with Mayor Tom, and a group of us, probably about 10 or 11 of us, and just talked about all kinds of different things that are going on in downtown, positives, challenges, things that, you know, when you're walking down, when you're in Hammond your entire life and you've been in downtown for a lot of it, everything just kind of, this is just downtown Hammond, but when you're walking with somebody who's an expert in this field all over the country and beyond the United States, you get a lot of insight that you just can't think of when it's right in front of your face. So we're very excited about this opportunity. I'm going to be very brief, which I know Chancellor Keon and the rest of you are going to be excited about. I'm just going to tell you how we got to this moment that we're here today and invited all of you. And I want to be clear, this was an invite-only event. We wanted people that we thought could be key stakeholders that will add value to this process that we're looking at for downtown Hammond. So the fact that you were invited should let you know that we think you're important in this process. You may not live in Hammond, you may not work in Hammond, but you have some sort of value to Northwest Indiana, which obviously downtown Hammond is to us a very important part of as well. Obviously in our downtown, we feel like we have a lot of positive things. We have stuff that I'm sure a lot of other downtowns would love to have, including, you know, Franciscan Alliance Hospital. We have 2 courthouses. We have a great grocery store. I know Jeff Strack is here from Strack and Van Til's, as well as office buildings that are doing well, some that aren't, but we have some positive office buildings that are almost fully occupied. So we have some positive things going on in downtown that we, you know, can build off of for sure. But there's no doubt that we have challenges in downtown Hammond. We are not the same community that we were 50, 60 years ago. And we're not necessarily trying to be that exact same, trying to create that exact same environment that we had. But we definitely could use a shot in the arm. I don't know if revitalization is the right word, but maybe it is. And that's why we're here, because we know that we need help. A few years ago, and again, this is the real short version, Mayor was contemplating moving City Hall to downtown Hammond. You probably read about it in the newspaper. Some of you were probably involved in the process. And we explored it. We spent a lot of time on it. The council, which we have several council people here, were heavily involved in that process as well. And in the end, we received quite a bit of resistance from folks that really 2 different types of demographics. Folks that were saying, what are you going to do with the historic City Hall that you currently have on Calumet Avenue, which is a legitimate question. And also people in that neighborhood that felt like City Hall was a part of their community, and that if it was removed from them, it would have taken a part of them with it. So that was the concerns and the resistance that we received, and in the end, Mayor and maybe to a certain extent the council decided at this time we're going to leave City Hall where it currently is. And it was kind of a tough one for us, because we were really getting excited about this possibility, and we knew moving City Hall to downtown would definitely be the shot in the arm that could take this into a different direction. But then, and again, this is a very simplified version of this, something kind of cool happened. And it was 18th Street Brewery said, hey, we're looking at downtown Hammond as a hub, as our manufacturing area, and we want to open this brewery. And we started working with them, and we have folks from 18th Street here with us today. And they did it. And we helped them through the process, but they did it. They opened up, and they proved to us that in this environment, a business can be a thriving business in downtown Hammond. And it definitely was kind of a wake-up for us. Like, 18th Street did it by themselves. They came in, took an old building that was basically being used as a large closet, and turned it into a very cool, thriving business that draws people from not just Northwest Indiana, but for sure from Chicagoland. And as of today, if you didn't know, there's now 2 breweries in downtown Hammond, 18th Street Brewery and Sour Note Brewery, and also 18th Street Distillery. So that has really taken off, and it showed us that there could be some positive things that happen right now. We just got to think this through and plan a little bit and do some homework. And so, again, it's not quite that simple, but Mayor started talking to our team and said, all right, economic development, let's start doing some homework and figuring out what else can we bring to downtown to start building off this? What can we do to keep moving in the right direction that we're proven it can be successful? And we bought some buildings, and we started looking at some buildings that potentially will never get renovated, and unfortunately, eventually they're going to have to be demolished. But sometimes it's addition by subtraction in those situations. And basically, it got us to the point where Ann Anderson, our Director of Economic Development, ended up going to Boston and attending a seminar about downtowns and walkable downtowns and thriving downtowns. And that's how we got to where we are today, which is having this exciting speaker to talk to you about some of the things that he's learned throughout his history and education and experiences. So with that, let me just briefly tell you a little bit about Mr. Speck. Jeff Speck is a city planner, an urban designer, an author, and a lecturer. His newest book, which is called Walkable City Rules, just came out last month. And from talking to a lot of you, I know a lot of you, when you heard about this, actually purchased the book and already read it before you came here. So kudos to you. And a lot of our team did that as well. He was Director of Design at the National Endowment of the Arts from 2003 to 2007. And for 10 years, he was Director of Town Planning at DPZ and Company, the firm behind the New Urbanism movement. And now he is principal of his firm, Speck and Associates, which is located in Boston, which is where Ann went for the seminar. He also created master plans, TOD designs, which we're talking a lot about right now with the potential Westlake Corridor extension projects coming on, and walkable studies for a variety of cities, including Memphis, Grand Rapids, Tulsa, Somerville, and Tampa, just to name a few. His resume is a lot deeper than that. But most importantly, he understands the importance of investing in the city's downtown and creating people-oriented places, which is why we're here today. So I would like to, if we can give a round of applause to our guest speaker, Mr. Jeff Speck.
Thank you, Philip. Hi, everybody. Invitation only, huh? Thank you all for having me. I don't know everyone that I should thank, but mostly I'm going to thank, where'd Ann go? Oh, I gave Ann my seat. And thank you for making the introduction. And I met today the person who introduced Ann to me, who I'm also thanking, although I forgot your name. I'm going to jump right into it. I don't want to take too much of your time, but I have a lot to say. And as often happens when I come to a place for the first time, although I've spent a lot of time in Indiana, when I come to a city for the first time, there's a lot that I realize, oh my gosh, you know, I had a talk and it was ready, but there's this new stuff I didn't know about, and I had to throw that in there too. And I'm wary of not overrunning my my promised stop time. So I'll jump right into it. I work to make places more walkable, and I'm a city planner. I was trained as an architect, and this whole walkability thing, which is now my thing, and I have 2 books with walkable in the title. You know, I'm not someone who's historically been a walking advocate, or, you know, let's walk to be healthier, or, you know, concerned particularly about what walking means. At least I didn't used to be. I was basically just a designer and a city planner who was trying to make better cities. And what I've learned in the past decade, I guess, is that the best way to explain a good city or a good urban design is in terms of walkability. And if you make a place that is walkable, you actually achieve all the goals that you were setting yourself out towards as just a designer. So all of a sudden, this work that I've been doing and my colleagues have been doing before me and my mentors, who I'll introduce to you, which we used to call the new urbanism, which turned off the conservatives. And then we called it, well, first we called it neo-traditional town planning. Neo-traditional town planning, because it was a reintroduction of how we used to make places. And that turned off the liberals. Then we called it new urbanism, which turned off the conservatives. Then we called it just best practice in urban design, which kind of turned off everyone, because, you know, what does that mean? And then we realized that when we reframed it in terms of what it really is, which is about making more walkable places, you can share the same information, teach the same stuff, approach the same goals, but in a way that people really understand. So I've kind of reframed my practice around this concept of walkability, and when you do that, then you step back and you say, okay, well then let's really ask ourselves what does make a place in which people make the choice to walk. So what I call my general theory of walkability, which is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek thing, because it is a theory, because it's a hypothesis, which I'm continuously trying to refine and modify through, you know, new things that I learn. But basically, the general theory of walkability asks the question, and it's the framework of my book, Walkable City, which will also be for sale downstairs. And at the end, I'll tell you about the different books and which one may be for you. But it asks the question, the general theory asks the question, how do you get people to walk? And that's in America, in which driving is so easy and so cheap. And you don't pay the full cost of driving by a long shot. If you own a typical American sedan, 4/5 of the cost of owning that car is owning the car, and 1/5 is driving the car. So the fixed costs are very high, and the variable costs are very low. The smart thing to do if you have a car is to drive it as much as possible. You know, each mile costs less than the mile before, and it's sitting there in the driveway between you and everything. So how do we create a circumstance in which people, a piece of your city, and I should say that most cities that are known for being walkable in the US are still mostly drivable, but they have a heart or a part that's walkable, and then they become known as walkable places. But in these circumstances, how do you create the environment in which people will make the choice to walk or bike, but we focus mostly on walking, instead of driving? And the answer is, of course, the walk has to be as good as the drive. But to do that, it has to do 4 things simultaneously. It has to be useful, it has to be safe, it has to be comfortable, and it has to be interesting. And that's the framework of my book that I showed you the cover of, Walkable City, which is my last book, which is now 6 years old. And it's the framework of my talk tonight. So we're going to go through each of these categories and see a little bit how they apply to Hammond as well. So the useful walk is a story that my mentor Andres used to tell. Andres, Dwani, and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk are the founders of DPZ, and that's where I spent the 10 years and really learned all this stuff from them. And Andres used to give a talk that he called the story of urbanism, the story of planning, the planning profession. And he reminded us that back in the 19th century, when people were choking on the soot from the dark satanic mills, right? And the planners who weren't yet called planners said, hey, why don't we move the housing away from the factories? And when they did that, lifespans increased immediately and dramatically. And the planners were then hailed as heroes. And we like to say they've been trying to repeat that experience ever since. So you have the onset of what's called Euclidean zoning, right? The division of the land into large areas of single use. And this was taught in planning school for probably 50, 60 years, that this was the proper way to plan. You know, that retail is separated from office, which is separated from medical office, from lower density housing, from higher density housing. Every use is separate. Every use gets its own large area. And this guarantees that you won't have a useful walk, of course, because if the other uses are far away and separated, then walking won't get you to them, right? And we now know this was wrong, and this isn't taught in planning school anymore. But it so happens whenever I go to a place to do a plan, or any of my colleagues, There's already a plan on the place, and the plan looks like this. Most of the American landscape now has this on it, and you have to undo it if you want to make a more walkable place. Now, I was an art history major in college, which they say is not the most lucrative major, but I can tell you, you don't want a Rothko, you want a Syrah. Syrah was the pointillist, right? And the more confetti-like, the more finer grain your mix of uses here in the most, technically the most walkable place in America in terms of how many people are walking, the more fine grain it is, and actually this red color is vertically mixed use, right? So the tinier your uses are, the more mixed together they are. That's how you make a more walkable place, because then walking serves a purpose. It takes you to something that's different from where you already are, which kind of gets us to the principal new urbanist argument, which I still give wherever I go. I learned this from Andres first in 1988, and it turned me on to doing this work. I thought I was going to be an architect like any architect, and I heard this story, and this was like the best story I ever heard because it explained so much to me. And what Andres explained back in the 80s was that there's only two tested ways to make community throughout history and around the world. There's a million ways to make a town, but there's only two that we've tested by the thousands. And one is the traditional neighborhood, and the other is suburban sprawl. And we've done a lot of both. The traditional neighborhood is defined in planning terms as being diverse, compact, and walkable. Diversity, at least in terms of use. You have places to live, places to work, places to worship, places to shop, places to recreate, all within the same neighborhood. And that's the sort of diversity that you find when you get that fine-grained mix of uses. It's compact. You're actually looking at several different neighborhoods of Newburyport. And what's interesting is if you look at any city, again, throughout history, you find that the neighborhoods tend to be a 5-minute walk from the edge to the center. So sprawl, in contrast, the traditional neighborhood developed naturally in response to man's needs. It was not invented. Sprawl was an invention after the war, or really kind of getting into the world wars, as a better way to live based on this amazing new invention, right? The automobile, which we celebrated and said we're going to design our landscape around the presumption of this automobile being used for everything. It's clearly not compact, right? Thus the name, sprawl. It's not diverse. Whole square miles will hold just one use, as I showed you, or just one house, right? Over and over and over again. And then look at the streets. Very few of the streets actually go anywhere. Loops and cul-de-sacs. So because so few of the streets connect, those few streets that do connect have to carry all the traffic. And so the entire traffic of a metropolis is reliant on very few streets. And so they're sized and designed. I mean, look at them, right? They're sized and designed around moving as many cars as possible, as quickly as possible. We call them traffic sewers. Like sewers, they're noxious. Walls and backs. See that? There's not a single address on any of these streets because we put a wall to it and the houses put their backs to it. And so it's not diverse, it's not compact, it's not walkable. And it's fun to break sprawl down into its constituent parts, the places where you only live, where you only work, where you only shop. Schools tend to get bigger and bigger, consolidated. We're still growing our schools, and for the pride of the school board or for the convenience or the efficiency, schools get bigger and bigger. But the bigger a school is, the further away from you it is, right? Think about it. And the size of the parking lot compared to the size of the school tells you all you need to know, which is no student has ever walked to this school. Actually, the seniors and the juniors are driving the freshmen and the sophomores with the car crashes to prove it. And then this is in South Florida, so is this. It's the westward expansion of Fort Lauderdale. It's called Weston, and their billboards say the feeling of a great small town. But they've grown, and they're very proud of their 8 soccer fields and their 8 baseball diamonds, et cetera. But actually, the child who lives here has to be driven 1.5 miles to get onto this traffic sewer to park in this giant parking lot. And and it's preposterous. When I present it to you this way, it's preposterous, right? That it's 1.5 miles from this house, because he ain't swimming, right? It's 1.5 miles from this house to this field. But if you create a whole society under the assumption that everyone's driving everywhere, then it makes perfect sense. But of course, it doesn't work if you can't drive. And a third of our population doesn't drive. And they become dependent on those who do. And all the other impacts that we know about. So if you separate everything from everything else and reconnect it only with automotive infrastructure, then your highway system, which was designed for, created for commerce and for vacation travel, basically becomes a commuting way. And I always tell people, this, for some, is still the American dream, the house just with other houses. And it is great to get into your first house, right? But if your house is just with other houses, the dream comes with a nightmare. And that's that you have to drive a lot of time, spend a lot of time driving from use to use, often, to absurd extremes, and the amount that we invest in our horizontal infrastructure. So, why does this exist? This is actually near my home. Not very near, but it's in Boston. And, this exists because the landscape that we've created around the automobile is so absolutely, soul-crushing and banal that if you have to wait more than one light cycle at any intersection, you just want to kill yourself, right? So that can't be allowed to happen. And that's why we do this, right? So being a driver can be very frustrating. This is not Photoshop. And it's tough on families. So the amount of time that we spend commuting is very destructive to the fabric of our families. Driving can stink, and being a pedestrian can be even worse. So, and then there's the doctors, the epidemiologists, who, I got this slide from a doctor. And he's been showing this slide for 15 years now. But what I haven't given you, and I'll talk about it at the end, but I haven't given you my talk on why walkability is so important. But one of the groups that really bring it home about why walkability matters are the epidemiologists, who talk about the fact that we have the first generation of kids in America who are expected to live shorter lives than their parents. And they say, yeah, diet matters and our diet stinks, but actually what it is principally is inactivity. And we've designed out of our society the useful walk. And the idea that it's not preposterous to you to park, to take the escalator, to go to the gym, to get on the treadmill, to walk, shows that there's something fundamentally wrong with the society we've designed. So this is the segment, and I'm now done with, on basically creating new places. But I always like to show it to people because we're still doing it. And if you add up the subdivisions and the shopping centers and the office parks being built in America, we are still building the equivalent of cities in this country every week or so. But they take this form and they never add up to anything, because each thing is big on its own property, and all that you have for a public realm is the arterial or the collector road in between. Traditional neighborhoods are the same stuff, but it's smaller, it's all mixed together, and then very importantly, you have that network of streets. And the great irony is, sprawl was designed around the car, but it actually works worse for cars because there's only one way to get anywhere, right? The collector road. So if there's an engine fire on your collector road, your whole system shuts down for an afternoon. Whereas here, there's actually 26 paths from there to there, different ways you can go. So it's a much more resilient, much more flexible system. And so if any of you are involved in the creation of new places, I hope you'll pay attention to this image. But what about existing places like Hammond and your downtown? Then we ask the same question about use. How can walking be as useful as possible? And we look at all the different uses in your downtown, and you ask what is missing or underrepresented. And now your downtown suffers from a lot of things being missing and underrepresented. But the thing that occurs in most of these places is that there's generally almost no, on the main street, in most mid-sized cities or smaller, there's almost no residential. And what we find is when you bring the residential back, that can often be the key thing to bringing all the other stuff back. Because actually, Jane Jacobs wrote about this, the best book ever, better than mine, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which Jane Jacobs wrote in, I think, 1961. And she was talking about Wall Street, where 400,000 people came every day to work. And she said, why is there not a single great restaurant on Wall Street? Why is there not a good gym on Wall Street? And the answer was what she called time spread. A good restaurant or a good gym needs a lunchtime crowd and a nighttime crowd. And what we find as downtowns come back in the US, and I've seen it happen in a lot of places, Oklahoma City, Cedar Rapids, smaller, larger, what happens is they get a significant enough residential to balance the workplace, right, like your hospital and your courthouse, and then you've got enough people around the clock for the other stuff, the stores and restaurants, to really have an audience. So that's super important. Des Moines is a city where I've done a lot of work over the years, most recently, last summer, we basically restriped all their streets. They're building it out over the next few years, but they've already started that. And if you've been to Des Moines, it's pretty amazing. There are cranes everywhere in Des Moines. And in 2000, they had 2,500 housing units downtown. This is one of the buildings that was renovated and filled with new housing. By 2020, they will have 10,000 housing units downtown. And they accomplished that by making it a goal and frankly, subsidizing it as a city. Saying developers are not making money building attainable housing, because the only housing that's going to come in your downtown early on when it's not that pretty is not the luxury stuff. And you want to have larger numbers, so you want it to be more attainable, particularly for people just out of college. And so they did a 10-year tax abatement so that developers could actually make money building housing downtown. 10-year tax increment finance on top of that, so 20 years of assistance for this work. And the issue is, in a lot of this work, is that, where do you find the parking? Now, you guys don't have an on-site parking requirement, I've learned, in your downtown, but your bankers probably do. The bankers who are lending to the developers to build this housing in the downtown, to renovate buildings, to bring housing in, they might require housing, and they might require parking. And so it's important as a city to actually help them identify existing parking in parking lots in your downtown, or even on street that can be assigned to that new housing. And that's what happened in Des Moines. So that's the first category. There's more to talk about, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the Safe Walk, which is actually where I spend most of my time. And I joke that I have 6 years of postgraduate architectural education, entertainment. 6 years of postgraduate architectural education. I spend almost all my time counting lanes and measuring them after all that, because it's the safe walk in our city that is the biggest challenge that most of our cities face, and it's because of the speed at which cars are traveling and the number and the width of the lanes that we find in the streets that I'm going to go through with you. But we're going to spend most of the rest of our time on this one. The last two, the comfortable walk and the interesting walk, are pretty quick, but also it's worth noting the useful walk, the comfortable walk, and the interesting walk are all pretty much a function of what's next to the streets, what's shaping the streets, the buildings, which are mostly private, right? Private development. The streets themselves are the part a city owns and a city can fix very quickly. So that's why more and more of my work has been focused on streets rather than the other stuff, because cities want to be better quickly. And it used to be, I got into this business in 1993 roughly, and everyone was doing 20-year plans. Eventually, everyone was doing their Vision 2020, right? No one wants to do 20-year plans anymore. Cities are like, how can I be remarkably better in 5 years? And the answer is the stuff you can fix quickly, and that's principally the safe walk on your streets. So I'm going to show you a bunch of different things that make walking safer and make cars less of a danger. They all point back to this concept, which is essentially the speed of vehicles in your downtown. Now there's the marked speed, and I heard someone tell me today that the downtown speed limit, correct me if this is wrong, that the downtown speed limit, or at least on some of your streets in the downtown, was changed some years back from 25 to 35, which is a big mistake. But what really matters more than that is the speed that's implied by the design of the environment. Because you set your speed very differently in a downtown area than you do on a highway. On a highway, you look for the speed limit, and if you're like me, you set your cruise control for 10 miles an hour over the speed limit, right? But in a urban area, you set your speed block by block based on your perception about how safe it is to drive, right? At what speed do I feel safe driving? And because of that, all the different factors that make, that increase friction, that make it feel a little more dangerous to drive fast, they're what makes it safe. So what are those factors? And by the way, this really adds up to, it's amazing how kind of geometric the relationship is between, what's the word? It's exponential, between speed and impact and injury and death. So if you're going 35 miles an hour, you're about 7 times as likely to kill someone as if you're going 25 miles an hour. So it's a huge difference, right? So the first issue is block size. This is Portland, famously walkable, Portland, Oregon, famously 200-foot blocks, tiny blocks, among the smallest in the US. This is Salt Lake City, famously less walkable, famously 600-foot blocks, and of course they're famously wide streets. This is my family holding up the flags that they put in a bucket by the side of the road for you to wave as you cross the street in Salt Lake City, so you won't be mowed down by a car. Because when you compare the cities, what you learn, and when you look at different cities, what you learn is that a 200-foot block city is roughly a 2-lane city. Portland averages about 2 lanes. A 600-foot block city is a 6-lane city, mostly about 5-lane. A lot of 5-lane streets. Almost every street is 5 lanes or more in Salt Lake City. Here's a study of 24 different California cities. When you double the average block size, roughly, you almost quadruple the number of non-highway fatal crashes. So there's a clear inverse relationship between block size and safety. Here's your downtown, and what you see here, it's the same scale, 200 feet. And what you see here is blocks are maybe 200 by 400. Now remember, Portland's about the smallest. You have a block here that because of this new school was doubled, and that's not great. It's not great to consolidate your blocks. But you can see you still have this network of blocks that aren't that big. Here you are compared to Portland. And remember, Portland is extreme. You're doing much better than Salt Lake City. And so this is what we call good bones, right? What this says to me is that you have a framework that will not, of blocks that will not stop your downtown from being more walkable. So it's not in the way. You go a bit east and you have this section. So this is when kind of post-war suburban autocentric planning landed in your downtown, right? And you have a cul-de-sac, and you have the housing here that the only address is a parking lot, and the effective size of the block is larger than the screen, right? And that's how you know this area, I don't care how many trails you put in it, right? That's how you know this area is not a walkable area of the city, because that small block size has been lost. So luckily we have this at the heart. And there have been a number of conversations that we've had today even about what's going to happen with streets in different directions. And the main message I want to leave behind is, don't do anything to undermine that porous, capillary system of lots of small streets, because that's essential to your walkability. Next is the number of lanes. The more lanes you have, the more it feels like a highway. This is a highway. This is not a highway. This is Oklahoma City before I did my work there. And the question I ask in a lot of places I go, because no one wants to have their traffic made worse. And by the way, I was out walking today, and someone in the group said, Jeff, are you going to help us slow the cars down? And I said, I never say slow the cars down. I say we're going to reduce illegal speeding. Because no one wants their cars slowed down. But what I think everyone can agree with is, wouldn't it be great if cars went the proper speed in your downtown? So, of course, the more lanes you have, the more it feels like a highway, the more lanes you have to cross, the more momentum you have in the same direction, all those things that make extra lanes make a street more dangerous. So this was the case in Oklahoma City when Prevention Magazine did its Best Cities issue, and Oklahoma City was named, Oklahoma City is the worst city for pedestrians in the entire country, which just isn't true. But the mayor came to me, I knew the mayor, and he said, what can we do about this? And I said, wow, let's do a walkability study. And he said, what's that? And I said, I don't know, I've never done one, but I'd like to, and what a great place to start. And I did my first. I've since done 14 of them. And this was more than 10 years ago. And we looked at the car counts. And this is what I mean when I say, I'm not here to make your traffic worse. We looked at the car counts in the downtown core, and we said, let's accept these car counts. Let's live with them. Let's expect that they'll grow over time even a little bit, right? And we know, and no engineer will disagree, that a 2-lane street without turn lanes, a 2-lane street will handle 10,000 cars per day. That's in all the engineering books. And then we looked at the car counts, 9,000, 6,000, 4,000, 5,000, 3,000, and we compared that with the just remade, just kind of updated downtown plan, in which these streets were all designated as 4- to 6-lane arterials. Look at the car counts on these streets. So almost all of them could have been 2-lane streets. Hudson, with 6 lanes at rush hour, because this was parking ban at rush hour, 6 lanes handling 2 lanes worth of traffic. And so we identified, we have a mismatch here between the supply of lanes and the demand for lanes, and let's just put them in sync, and then we'll have more opportunity to make the streets safer. We can add more parking. We can add parallel parking where it's missing. We can turn parallel parking perhaps into angle parking if there's extra room for it. We can add bikes. We can add bike lanes to use up some of that extra street space, as well as to provide biking. So fortunately, you know, this study happened to be released like a week before Devon Energy decided to build this giant tower in the downtown, and that was creating $200 million in tax increment. And they said, what can we spend this money on? I know, let's rebuild every downtown street from building face to building face in our 40-block central business district. And it was my job to basically design the curb to curbs of all these streets. And the plan doubled the amount of on-street parking, which is great for merchants, of course, and it added a whole bike network where there was zero bike network before. So a typical street that's 4 lanes like this becomes 2 lanes with better sidewalks. Here it is under construction. And then a street like this, Sheridan, which was one of the busiest streets through the downtown, we had to keep the turn lane at corners, but the lanes we were able to narrow, and now it looks like this. And it's about 2/3 done, and you know, the mayor just came out with a book called The Next American City, but he tells this story about how the downtown really has come back to life. And it's important to understand, though, that you can't always rebuild. This is my how to save money slide. And most of the work I do in cities, after I show that Oklahoma City example, I like to show this slide and say, you can restripe. I'm going to show you an exception at the end. But you can restripe a whole piece of a city for the price of rebuilding one street. So we're always looking for opportunities to do it with paint and not just with construction. So here's another fun one. And you've already done one of these improperly. And I'll show you that. But this is called the classic American road diet. And again, the idea is, how do we improve safety without harming the traffic flow in a way that makes people angry? So this is a 4-lane street. 4-lane streets are very dangerous because the speeding lane is also the turning lane. And so there are tons of rear-enders. And then this person lets you go, right? But then this person hits you. They're extremely dangerous. The classic American road diet basically turns it into 3 lanes. And it does so by putting something else in the street, bike lanes or parking. But you get about 11 feet when you remove a lane from a typical American street. So that's a win, because you can then dedicate it to parking or bikes or something else. But the real win, of course, is how much the injury accidents drop when you make these changes. That's no surprise to people. But the real surprise is this chart, which I discussed in our walk today with the mayor. This is, I think, 21 different road diets of different streets all around the U.S. And if you look at the number of cars per day before and the number of cars per day after, it's essentially identical. Because a 4-lane street isn't just unsafe, it's inefficient. You know, the speeding lane is the turning lane, so you're always jockeying, and you know, the jockeying causes the people to put on the brakes, which then causes those pulse waves you've probably read about that causes traffic jams, et cetera. So this is an amazing win-win, don't lose, in the sense of safer travel, something else like bikes or parking, and then no impact on throughput. So whenever you have a 4-laner, there's some exceptions, but in most cases, whenever you have a 4-laner, you can make it a 3-laner with no suffering. And so you have these. You have streets in the downtown like Douglas that are 4 lanes. They could easily be 3 if they have. Now, the other thing I want to show you, look at these car counts. 24, 20, 16, 18, 21. You get the idea, right? So they're mostly around 20 or a little below. Certainly if a street is, as we said, if it's under 10, you don't need that center turn lane. I suspect that Douglas is well under 10. And so it could actually be a 2-laner. And the proof is probably the people who are parking there, right? And that's probably not allowed during rush hour, or at least at one point wasn't. But this is a street that probably could be completely restriped as a 2-lane throughout. My guess, based on the number of cars. Yeah, here's where the parking is happening. Then you have north of here, is this also in Homan? Mm-hmm. North of here, you did something I also found in Evansville, Indiana, which you had a 4-laner, and it was turned with parking, and it was turned in just like you have right in the heart of the downtown here. You'll notice you go a little bit south on Homan from where we are right now, and you'll find 4 lanes, I'll show it to you in a minute, 4 lanes of traffic and 2 lanes of parking. That was the same width, roughly. And what you did is what they did in Evansville, which is you basically made all the lanes wider. You didn't add a bike lane, you didn't add bike lanes, you didn't add more parking. You basically just distributed it so that now we've got 70-mile-an-hour lanes, but 3 of them. As opposed to 4, 30-mile-an-hour lanes, you've got 3 70-mile-an-hour lanes. So this is not the way to do it. But don't feel bad, Evansville did it first. Now, the other thing I need to raise, because I've just talked about the incredible power of a center turn lane, is that you don't want center turn lanes where you don't need them, because they widen the street. In this case, they eliminated, this used to be a viable block of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which is no longer viable. These stores are all pretty much dead because they lost their curb parking, right? And they lost their curb parking because of this football field length left turn lane that was inserted by the state DOT, because state DOTs do this, to get to a street that has 7 houses on it and goes basically nowhere. So this one street, this one turn lane, which traffic engineers tend to just do as a matter of course. Why not have the left turn lane? It makes traffic flow more smoothly. But if your goal is not more smooth flow, but a vital and successful downtown, then you don't put left turn lanes in where you don't need them. Where do you need them? You need them where serious congestion is caused by cars waiting to turn left. What we learned in Oklahoma City and what the local engineer did in Oklahoma City was, if there's not 10,000 cars per day, we will not allow it. And there was a lot of backlash about that, but she succeeded in achieving that, and there were no traffic problems subsequently. So that's kind of the threshold, 10,000 cars or fewer, no left turn lane. So Fayette Street, which I'm guessing has considerably less than 10,000 cars per day, probably does not need this left-hand turn lane, which you can see, it's parked on both sides of the street, but you lose one side of parking all the way from here to the corner, probably 200 feet, because of that left-hand turn lane, right? So, wow, it'd be nice to have that parking back. We can get rid of that lane, which will make it safer. And yes, it might take you 10 seconds longer to get through, but it won't cause undue congestion, and the whole network will be safer. Next is one-way streets, which some people, it's a little counterintuitive, because I've been at events where people say, well, I only have to look one way to cross. Doesn't that make the street safer? But the data is now very clear that one-way streets are much more multi-lane one-way streets are much more dangerous than the two-way streets they used to be. And almost every one-way street in our country used to be a two-way street, unless it was built very recently. This one's in Davenport, Iowa, where my wife is from. And just the sheer kind of momentum of all these cars going in the same direction, but especially just the opportunity to jockey, the opportunity to be in a faster lane. And whatever lane you're in, the other lane's faster, right? So that opportunity makes it a much more dangerous street. And recent evidence is from Louisville, Kentucky, where Brooks, first, second, and third were 2 one-way pairs, and they decided to revert Brooks and first. And when they did it, and they kept the other 2 as one-way. And when they did it, car crashes on Brooks and first went down by half. Crime went down by 23%. The one-ways, car crashes went up and crime went up. So citizens understand this. This is New Albany, Indiana, where I did a big job about 4 years ago. These were all one-way streets in their downtown, every one. And traffic was really bad. I should say speeding was really bad. And I did a plan with my colleagues that reverted all these streets back to two-way. And they did nothing for 3 years, and then last summer they did it all in a month. They just converted every street back to two-way traffic, and it's a lot safer there now. You have one major offender in your downtown, which is Russell Street, which does not need to be one-way in this area. Now, it may need to be one-way, depending on the car count, it may need to be one-way in this area. But as soon as you get to Homan and cross it from there, it can be two-way again. And I would bring two-way traffic back to the street, which also, if you know, it's kind of possible to have to go in big loops when you're over by the courthouse because of the one-way nature of this street. So it would make the downtown much more kind of maneuverable to make that change, which I recommend. But I just want to make it clear, I'm not talking about your one-lane one-ways, because those are pretty safe. But I do have some ideas for these smaller streets in your downtown that I'll show you in a minute. So we talked about the number of lanes, we talked about the direction of the lanes, now the width of the lanes, which I hinted at before. Andres Duani used to show this slide, and he'd say, the typical road to the typical subdivision in America is now wide enough to allow you to witness the curvature of the earth. And it's true, because the standards have just, look, someone even did donuts here, right? The standards have changed. Here's a subdivision from the 60s. Look at the width of the streets. And here's a subdivision from the 80s. Same height of airplane, right? Same size house. 60s streets, 80s streets. This is my old neighborhood in South Beach. It wasn't draining properly on our summer afternoon thunderstorms, so they had to rebuild the curbs. But when they rebuilt the curbs, this new standard kicked in. It was working perfectly well before, but this new standard kicked in. We lost half our sidewalk and our street trees. The standard bears no relation to what really works. And as I suggested earlier, what happens in wider lanes? You know intuitively, whether you've read the manuals or not, you know that a 10-foot lane is like a 30, 35 mile an hour lane, and a 12-foot lane is a 70 mile an hour lane. And 12-foot lanes is what you find on the highway. But when you put it in a downtown, people drive faster. Here's a study that shows how people drive faster on wider streets. Here's another study that talks about the injuries and deaths that happen from that. And residents understand this. Residents will often fight for narrower streets. And then we build streets like this with some struggling. We always have to fight for it. But when we're doing a new subdivision, this is a new town outside of Charleston called Ion. And this is a little residential street now. We're not talking about a 10-foot lane or 12-foot lane. We're talking about a local street which can actually handle traffic in both directions on a much skinnier lane. It's actually called a yield street or a queuing street. Many of our neighborhoods historically have had these. And they do again now because we're trying to bring these back. This is the developer Vince Graham who built this with us in South Carolina. He's a very good public speaker. He goes to conferences and he shows his beautiful narrow streets, and he quotes this famous philosopher who said, "Broad is the road that leads to destruction, narrow is the road that leads to life." And it's true, actually. Here's Portland's skinny street program. And now again, we're talking about local streets, not major downtown streets. But the idea that if you have this shared two-way travel on a local street, you only really need about 12 feet or so. And when a car's coming at you, I grew up on a street like this. I'm sure many of you did also. When a car's coming at you, you just tuck into the parking lane. And this is why we used to be able to play street hockey and ultimate frisbee in our streets. 26 feet, this is important for what I'm going to show you in a minute. 26 feet, you can park both sides and have two-way travel, okay? But when it comes to your downtown and your main street, 10 feet remains the standard. And thank goodness this is only a year or two old now. NACDO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, says lane widths of 10 feet are appropriate in urban areas and have a positive impact. So that's the measure then that we want to apply. And when you make it wider, people will drive too fast. I described this part of Homan Avenue, just a little bit south of here, and it's perfect. Now, should it be 4 lanes? We're going to talk about that. But it's 10, 10, 10, 10, 8, 8, 56, proper measurement. You do not need the lanes to be wider than this. Now, going back a bit, could this do a 4 to 3 lane diet? If it's 4, it can be 3. The answer is probably yes, right? Now, here, as Homan heads north, approaching where we are right now, it's approaching the bridge. And the bridge over the railroad tracks, it's basically a 3-lane road as it heads south. Then it crosses the tracks, and because all of those bridges over tracks everywhere in America are engineered like highways, not sure why, but they're engineered like highways. It lands as 4, but then the engineer who built it decided, for good measure, let's put a 5th lane in the middle, even though the car counts don't suggest it at all. The car counts on this street here are about 16,000, 17,000 cars per day. So remember, it fits at the lower end of that chart of 21 streets that I told you could be 3 lanes, right? But what's happening is to approach that left-hand turn lane with its own left-hand turn lane here, we've lost parking from all the way from back here all the way to the bridge. There's no parking on this street, which you could get back. And not only that, as it approaches the bridge, right here's the parking lot, we're right here. As it approaches the bridge, the street widens from 56 feet that I showed you to 62 feet. So you have 5 lanes in 62 feet. So each one is more than 12 feet. And that's another reason why people are speeding. People are coming off the bridge and they're able to maintain that highway speed and that highway attitude because they're being absorbed and forgiven by these wide highway lanes. Something you can fix immediately and you should fix quickly, right? This is just continuing through your downtown. And then you have streets like Russell. I find this in a lot of cities. Like some firemen came through and for some reason thought that this whole thing had to be a clear zone. Or maybe it was loading for a business that isn't there anymore. Or for some reason the curbs were protected from parking. That would be acceptable if this was 20 feet. But it's 32.5 feet. So here's again another street where you could have parking down the whole length of it. If it's one way, if it's two way, it doesn't matter. You can have 2 10-foot lanes and a wide parking lane down one side the whole way. And then you have Fayette Street we talked about, and this is getting a little bit subtle and sophisticated, but if we, ignoring what happens towards the corner, which I showed you, here you have what could be basically 8, 10, 10, 8. These used to be 7, and 7.5 is perfectly fine, so 35 for a street is fine. So what do you do when you've got a 41 and it could be 35? And in a number of cities, what we do is we just put in one bike lane. We find the partner somewhere else, right? But we put in one bike lane in one direction, just even if no one ever bikes on it. It narrows the lanes to a safer width, and people drive a more reasonable speed. And of course, people do end up biking on it when you provide a decent network. And then finally, I want to get back to Condit Street and all the other, so we find these west of downtown, we find them right of downtown in these residential neighborhoods, that these are all one-way streets. And this would be a complex public effort because residents are always worried when you change their streets. But this street, which is one-way, remember 26 feet for two-way in Portland, this is 29 feet. And by the way, we find these in Skaneateles, New York, lake effect, tons of snow. We find these in a lot of places with a lot of snow. The snow isn't a factor. This is all these little residential streets that are on either side of your downtown could be two-way. And that would make them safer. I'm not sure if it's an effort worth pursuing, but I just wanted to bring that up as a possibility. Biking is the next issue. A street with bikes in it, technically, pedestrians are always worried about being hit by bikes. It almost never happens. You're more likely to be killed by a vending machine than you are hit by a bike as a pedestrian. It's true. But I like to say that cycling is the biggest, in terms of in planning, cycling is the biggest revolution currently underway in only some American cities. And what we've seen is the cities that invest in cycling get cycling. Weather matters, topography matters, culture matters, but none of those things matter anything like investment. Portland, Oregon was biking just a little bit more than your typical American city. And then for 30 years, they invested a total of $65 million in bike lanes. Only a couple million a year, but for 30 years. And by the way, Oslo in Norway just decided to invest $500 million in bike lanes. Portland invested $65 million. And they created a bike network, and this is important, a bike network that was actually big enough and comprehensive enough to be useful. And a lot of cities put in one bike lane here, one bike lane there, and they're like, where are the cyclists? But it has to be useful or you won't create that population. And I asked my friend Tom Brennan to send me some pictures of the bike commute in Portland. And I said, well, was this bike to work day? He goes, no, this is Tuesday in Portland because they made that investment. And of course, this is a revolution that's certain cities have embraced and others haven't. Pittsburgh here. Chicago here, you've probably seen these in Chicago. But this is the new kind of gold standard, at least for America. It's the protected, the buffered bike lane. This is a parked car. It used to be parked here. One lane was removed from the street. The parking is pulled off the curb, and that creates the protected bike lane with a 2 or 3 foot door zone, and then in this case, 2 directions of cycling. This guy's in the wrong lane. So is this guy. I'm not sure what's happening here. But it's really a wonderful model. Here's one of the ones that was done in New York City. And it's a similar story as with the road diet. You have a 3-lane road becoming a 2-lane road. These cars are pulled off the curb to create this protected facility. And of course, the number of cyclists went up because they had someplace to go. Speeding dropped precipitously. Injury crashes dropped precipitously. But the big surprise was that the street handles just as many cars in New York, right? It handles just as many cars before as it handles just as many cars now as it did before. Because basically what they were doing was jockeying and racing from red light to red light. And now they're just proceeding a little more calmly but with equal efficiency down the street. So, this being New York City, of course, there was a 5-year blistering lawsuit. But eventually the bike-hating NIMBY trolls grudgingly surrendered to reality. And I like to show this picture and contrast it with this picture because, again, this is what we do in Washington, D.C. when a street has an extra 5 feet in it, right? We just wanted the cars to go more slowly and to welcome bikes. So we put in a 5-foot bike lane, and this is better than not having the bike lane. But you really, no one wants their daughter in the door zone, right? So that's why this is much better. And the real problem with these is of course, the UPS truck, the Amazon truck, the Uber that's pulled over and never goes into the parking spot. They'll always just sit right there. There's always something in the bike lane, often preposterously. So that's another reason why protected lanes are much more effective at creating population. And then there's just this whole complete streets movement, right? Have you guys heard of this term? It's a great term, complete streets, and it's well-intentioned and it's done some good things. But just putting a bike lane in an unsafe street, whether she's got a stroller or is on a bike, that is not a place to put a bike lane, unprotected, because you will have injuries. It's not a cult. This is the blessing of the bikes in New York City. In Denver, you keep seeing articles like this. If you're trying to attract tech talent, young, educated talent, cycling is part of that. And this used to be what people would think of when it came to a cyclist, the mammal, the middle-aged man in Lycra, right? But this is your new goal. This is your target audience. And of course, you have a really good, a regionally, admired bike trail network here. And it makes you think, you want to create a system which is more comprehensive and more useful. I look at Homan, at least south of the bridge, I'm like, well, who's going to take Homan when this thing is just a block away, right? So you have to do it skillfully and understand that an off-street trail is a much superior experience than something in the street. But I think it's a goal worth pursuing. Parallel parking, which I already discussed as missing from parts of Homan and elsewhere, is an essential barrier of steel that protects the curb from moving vehicles. And I used to say, just try to have sidewalk dining if you don't have parallel parking. And then I went to Fort Lauderdale, and I had it proved for me. This is happy hour in Fort Lauderdale. This is Himmershey Boulevard, happy hour street. And you can see you're allowed to park this way, but not this way, at least before my study. Now you can. And this is happy hour on the park side of the street, and this is happy hour on the unparked side of the street. And now they brought the parking back. This restaurant failed, but there's a new one, and it's okay because they brought the parking back. No one wants to be right up against those cars moving so fast, and that's the experience you get. I changed the name from Homan to Oh Man, because you think you're going to get hit by a car. And then the other part is the trees. The engineers used to call these FHOs, fixed and hazardous objects. The street tree, which theoretically increases the danger for the driver because it's a potential obstacle you might hit. Until someone actually did a study in Orlando and found that along the same street, the area that has the trees has fewer injury accidents than the area that doesn't have the trees, because it actually turns out the trees slow the cars down, sometimes dramatically, but better to hit a tree than a pedestrian, and the presence of trees next to the street generally causes people to drive more cautiously. And this is what a street feels like when you don't have the parallel parking, you don't have the street trees, and it's the Homan experience that I told you about. Push buttons, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this explaining to you why 80% of these don't work and actually do nothing, but this artist has the right idea. With the exception of Boston, principally with the exception of Boston, which I'm glad to live in, but I don't like this, Boston has push buttons and it's a walkable city. Almost every other seriously walkable city in the US does not have push buttons. And they're generally not something you find in a walkable place. You should be automatically getting the walk signal without having to ask for it. And when the cars get the green, you should get the walk. That's not what happens here. You know, we were crossing here. We've done in one day. We've done more jaywalking than I'm usually doing a week, because you have kind of an anti-pedestrian signal regime that treats the pedestrian as a second-class citizen, and you often find it in conjunction with these push buttons. But for your more walkable parts of your city, particularly on Homan and in your downtown, you should really get rid of them. But at the very least, you should have a signalization regime that you get to walk as soon as the cars get the green. In fact, you should have what's called an LPI, a lead pedestrian indicator, where you get it 3 seconds you get it 3 seconds earlier. And that allows you to claim the crosswalk before the cars try to turn into you. And that's what a lot of cities are now doing. So that's the end of the safety. And the last two are quick, so we're getting near the end. But I wanted to show this one example, because I said, don't rebuild, restripe. But every now and then you hear about something that happened that's remarkable. And this is Lancaster, California, where they said, let's invest. And they did this. And they did it for $11.2 million, which is a lot of money. Injury crashes went down by half. Pedestrian crashes went down by more than 3/4. Pedestrian activity doubled. 57 new businesses opened. 800 new housing units were built. 2,000 new jobs came with a $282 million economic impact. So I have one of the rules. My new book is called 101 is Walkable City Rules: 101 Steps to Making Better Places. And one of the steps is rebuild or restripe or rebuild, question mark, because obviously it's better to do 10 streets than one street. But if you've got a city that its heart, like yours, its heart is really just one street, maybe it makes sense to invest in building on that one street. And clearly, the $11.2 million leading to a $282 million impact, which of course the city gets taxes off of to pay back that investment, clearly was worth it. So I think it's important to remember that there are stories like this all around the U.S. The comfortable walk is a little bit counterintuitive. We all love wide open spaces, long views, but we really love experiences. We pay a lot of money to get on airplanes to go to cities that have spaces like this, because a plaza is only as good as its edges, and a public space is only as good as its walls, and we like to say as designers, we're trying to make outdoor living rooms. And the reason is that the evolutionary biologists tell us that all animals, humans among them, we're simultaneously seeking prospect. We want to see our predators before they get us, and refuge. We want to feel that our flanks are covered. And if our flanks don't feel covered, we don't feel safe. It's in our bones. We can't help it. Millions of years of evolution make us crave spaces like this. And we've been talking about these ratios for a long time. What's the best ratio? 1:1 is the Renaissance ideal. 3:1 is great. Beyond 6:1, unless there's trees to neck it down, beyond 6:1, roughly, you don't really feel enclosed anymore. So, Salzburg, 1:6, further north than Boston, but no one's doing shadow studies in Salzburg. It's all dark and beautiful. The opposite of Salzburg, of course, is Houston. And this part of Houston is actually much better now, and Houston has come a long way. But I showed this slide because it tells an important lesson, which is it is the surface parking lot that's the principal villain in this conversation about spatial definition and the lack of spatial definition that makes you feel enclosed and comfortable on a street. And so, not the prettiest building, I guess, but this is a very nice space. You get the sense, traffic configuration aside, you get the sense that you're in a nice outdoor living room here, as opposed to the area further south, right, where you have surface parking lot and surface parking lot, and you don't have the spatial definition. You even have something better going for you, which is this slight S-curve in the street, which is remarkable because you have spatial definition on the sides, and your vista is also, it's called vista termination. Your vista is terminated. So you really feel like you're in a space here, so you have a pretty ideal, I wish more main streets had that little angle, straight angle like yours do, because it makes it a much better spatial definition. But then you have this condition up here where the buildings were lost, and you have the surface parking lot there. And so the trees help, right? But you're really losing that sense of space on that side of the street. And you know, the general rule of thumb is when you have a public space, you want to have buildings that not only shape it, but give energy and life to it with front doors and windows and other things. And here you've got this little fountain, but you've got a parking lot here and the parking lot over there. And then you have your courthouse, which has a real, you know, let's do a traditional town square in front of the courthouse, but there's no definition, except for a little bit over here. That's also lacking its shape from buildings around it. But then zooming in here, this is where the greatest opportunity is, and perhaps the place to invest first in bringing a sense of completion to your downtown. And then also here, by the courthouse, these two corners are super important. A lot of people work here. They might want to walk into downtown to eat when there's a better place to grab a bite, but this intersection doesn't feel very comfortable because of all the surface. So these are also two very important sites in your downtown. And then finally, the interesting walk. You know, we humans, we're among the social primates. Nothing interests us more than other humans. We want signs of humans, human activity. If there's no people, we want to see doors and windows and other things that suggest there might be a person soon. And you know, the 1-to-1 ratio we talked about is the Renaissance ideal. This is 1-to-1. This is in Grand Rapids, which you probably know has quite a nice walkable downtown, but no one wants to walk on this street, which is, you know, between the two best hotels in town, because when one side is an exposed parking deck and the other side is a hotel conference facility that was apparently designed in admiration for that parking deck, you know, it's just boring, right? It's too boring. So this is where we say, okay, blame the I blamed everyone else, blame the architects for this one. But Mayor Riley in Charleston, South Carolina, a friend of mine, he was mayor for 40 years, he taught us it only takes 20 feet of building to hide 200 feet of parking. So you put something in front, or you have a retail ground floor, or both, but hiding parking decks is super important. This is one in Miami Beach. I call it the Chia Pet Garage. But again, the retail, historic preservation below parking. And then blank walls, too, like the boring moments when you might walk, but you just turn around because it's just too dull. That's the perfect place for public art. And you know, I spent a lot of money when I was at the NEA on like sculptures that plopped and landed in plazas. But I'm now convinced that actually mural programs and livening up dead walls is a more remedial, right, remedy, a more remedial purpose for our public art money. This is an American example. Here's a European example, but you know, take care of it, keep it clean. All right, moving right along. So you have, like every city, you have, I heard this was the bluer part of Indiana, so I could show that slide. You have exposed parking decks, every city does, you know, just, you need to have a rule. Half the cities in America now have this rule. No exposed parking structures up against sidewalk edges. Set them back 20 feet, put attainable housing or something else in between. And then I was able to shoot this nice picture today. It's not a boring building, it's a lovely building, but when you're down the street level, because there's no activity here, you know, this is the proper solution. Like this, these guys are like, what's going on? I'm going to pose. But the art there is wonderful. And then finally, I got to talk to you guys about historic preservation, because I got the feeling here that I get in most cities I go to, which is that you don't value it as much as I do. And I've done a lot of work in a lot of places. This was a real loss, and I know that it was no one's intention, right? This was that. As recently as the Google, this was that. And now it's this. And that's a beautiful building. And now it's this. And that's a real loss. And that's unfortunate, and it's too late. But then there's a building like this, which is your best building. In terms of its overall quality, it's your best building in your downtown, which is still leaking. And right now, it's probably in good enough shape that it is savable. But in 3 or 4 or 5 years, it won't be. And then the owner will say, hey, we couldn't save it because it was just too damaged. Well, you could have weatherproofed it for a limited cost. And it's just super important that you do that. There's a wonderful economist named Donovan Ripkema, And what Don Ripkema says is that he talks about the importance of historic preservation in our older cities. And he says, in competitive economies, it's the differentiated product that commands a monetary premium. And what he means by that is, why would anyone bother to visit you or live here if you just look like everywhere else? And it's the older buildings you have that make you unique, that make you special. If you lose this, you're losing your edge against the Papa John's out by the highway. But this is what makes you special. And if you want to be competitive as a place for people to come and live and spend time, you need to save these buildings. His other famous quote is, don't just do something, sit there, right? But let it sit there and this and any other building in your downtown that's from pre-war, you really need to, if it's empty, fine, but don't let it deteriorate to the point where you then have to lose it. And that's everything. But I want to end just with a concept that I've learned from a lot of this work that I've done or seen other people do. And people often ask the question, is it really worth this much effort for your downtown? But the downtown is really the one truly potentially, already somewhat, but truly potentially walkable part of your city. There's a lot of cities like, does anyone know Greenville, South Carolina? Greenville, South Carolina, everyone's going there now. It's just, their economy is booming. It's the most beautiful, walkable city. You go there, it's one good street. The rest of the streets aren't that good. But they have one great street, and they've developed this whole reputation, this whole energy around being a wonderful, walkable city. The fact is you just need a part of your city that provides that walkable lifestyle, either for the people who want to live in that environment, and will pay extra for it, or for other people who want to have a more suburban life, but they can visit it, they can enjoy that urbanism, that street life that is not available elsewhere in the city. And the other thing is, the downtown is the one part of your city, if you think about it, wherever you live in the city, you kind of own the downtown too. The downtown is the one part of the city that belongs, the only part of the city that belongs to everybody, right? And so when you invest in downtown, you're actually investing in the city of everyone, and not just a neighborhood for one person or a neighborhood for another person. And then finally, I think people's impression of a city, when they picture your city, when they think about Hammond, what kind of city is this? They're picturing the downtown. And that could be a lot better, right? But that's people's mental image. So it's worth the investment in your downtown. And a number of us had this impression today, those of us who've worked in other cities and been around a bit and seen what's happened in the last 20 years, is that your downtown looks and feels now like a lot of places that are really doing great now felt about 15 years ago, right? You've got the same bones, you got the same, we talked about good bones, you've got the same good edges, you got the same good historic stock. There's no reason why you, in a decade or so, couldn't be having the experience of all these other kind of comeback cities that you've been hearing about. But if it happens, it's going to be happening in this part of your city, in the downtown. And you can see little things already happening that have the character that is similar to what we've seen in other cities. And yes, it starts with little things like this, very small, very one-off, unique, that you don't really find, and you're not going to find it out by the highway, right? So that's very promising to me. So I'm done, but let me share with you some resources before I go. So there's two books. There's the new one, Walkable City Rules, and there's Walkable City. If you should read this one first. My publisher would rather I told you, buy the new book. This book is for everybody. This book was the best-selling book in planning for about 4 years because it's for everybody. And it basically tells this story, but in a way that anyone can enjoy it and have fun with it. It has no pictures because it's like, it's literary nonfiction. This book is full of pictures, charts, graphs, data, and is for people who are doing the work or as professionals or public servants or activists, right, who want to get the stuff done. And it's hopefully also well written, but it's much more technical. So those are your choices. But it is fun to look at, even if you're not doing the work. And it's number one. Woo! If you want to hear the story about towns versus sprawl and that whole conversation, this is the book that I wrote with my mentors on that topic that I recommend to you. And then, if the good news is that we're being videoed, so this talk will be available to, I hope, whoever wants it, certainly on your closed circuit city station, but eventually I'm sure the city and Anne and her team can get it to anyone who wants it. But if you want a 15-minute version of what I just gave you tonight with no Hammond examples, there's this TED Talk. And the whole talk I didn't give you about why walkable cities are so important for our health, for our wealth, for our environment, is this talk. And they're both at TED.com. Finally, I met Anne because I teach a course at Harvard every summer. Boston was mentioned, but it's Harvard. And it's 2 days long, and this coming one is in June. And it's a nice small class, and we spend 2 days doing this and some case studies and other fun stuff. And it's Harvard, so it's not cheap. But when you're done, you get a piece of paper that makes it really look like you graduated from Harvard. So it's worth every penny. And then finally, there's my website that has links to all these things. So if you don't want to write anything down, just write down my website, and you can get to all of it after that. There's opportunity for us to gather afterwards. I've taken enough of your time in this room. I will be down at the book signing table immediately after also to talk to you, and I hope I get to talk to many of you. So thank you so much for your attention.
I think after hearing Mr. Speck, you get the idea of why we're so excited to bring him here and talk about these things. And some of these things are not really difficult. Some of these things are things we can institute sooner than later. But again, I want to remind every one of you, you're here for a reason. We need your help. It's not going to be so simple to put a bunch of government people in charge of this project and think everything's going to run smoothly. There's a lot of other people who have a lot of different reasons to invest in downtown Hammond because we're all connected in Northwest Indiana and in Chicagoland for that matter. So thank you for coming. Don't think you're leaving here and you're never going to hear from us again, because you will. Just as Mr. Speck and our team have a meeting tomorrow morning with the mayor to continue the discussion on this. As Mr. Speck said, he is going to have his book downstairs if you want to purchase, and of course he'll sign it for you right away. And as I told most of you as I was rushing you to put your drinks and your food down, we have another reception at 18th Street Brewery. If you've never been there before, I'm telling you, you're 30 seconds away. Come by. Let's talk a little bit about what we learned today, and we'll see where the discussion goes. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending.